Welcome once again to our studies in the account that Mark, an early follower of Jesus, records for us of Jesus' life, teaching and miracles. As is my practice, I would like to read to you the passage we're studying today, chapter 6, verses 6 to 13. There we read, "Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village. Calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out, 2 by 2, and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town, and if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. Every so often, Mark ceases from recording in detail the events of Jesus' life and offers us what we might describe as the headlines. He does that here. So sandwiched between Jesus' rejection by his own townspeople in Nazareth and the martyrdom of John the Baptist, we have the present short and summary passage. Simply, we're told Jesus shared his ministry with the little group of intimates who were following him. Following him, they are called to teach and show that as his followers, malevolent spiritual powers and physical pain and suffering are subject to them. In this way, Jesus is shown to be the one promised by God for centuries past, who would bring to an end the sorry state of humankind's alienation from God. Two things seem to stand out in the way Mark describes what took place. The first is that Jesus was anxious that as many people could learn as much as they could about him, and that the evidence for who he was widely demonstrated as it possibly could be. There are religions, and there were some in Jesus' day, that are secretive and hide behind a veil of mystery and secrecy. They either seem designed for a select few followers, or hide their teachings behind esoteric and inaccessible rituals and mysterious texts. Jesus seems determined to show that his message is accessible to all, and that it is demonstrably true. The authority that he and his followers show makes this, in Mark's view, self-evident. It seems very clear that this is why Mark thought it was important to include this brief story. We know by now that Mark realizes that what he claims for Jesus is pretty incredible. But he's consistently emphasized that to follow in Jesus' footsteps through the stories he tells provides enough evidence to, step by step, strip away any doubts. Jesus' disciples, sharing his authority, were teaching in a way that no one else had ever taught, and they were performing miracles the like of which had never been seen before, even in Israel, where the miraculous, as we've already seen, had been something that was almost commonplace. And it is this unassailable evidence that Jesus is unique and fulfills all the promises that God had made over many centuries of someone who was coming to put the world to right that explains, I think, the rest of the passage. Let me just remind you what Mark tells us. He says that Jesus told his disciples, "Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town, and if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." The assumption Jesus makes here is that there will be those who will welcome his disciples and the message that they bring. Unlike those of Nazareth in our last story, they will be able to put aside their prejudices and see beyond them, and gradually begin to perceive who Jesus is. For them, the experience will be that of receiving good news, the good news that Mark has promised all along. But that will not be the whole story. As with Nazareth, so with the surrounding towns and villages, there will be those who are offended by the teaching about Jesus, even if here it is backed up by miracles. We've already seen how Mark provides us with various explanations for why people presented with the claims of Jesus refuse to accept them. Mark is less interested in that here. What he does do, however, is emphasize two things. First of all, as we've already seen, he believes that to reject Jesus, his message, and the evidence for who he is simply absurd. To fail to welcome Jesus is to ignore the sort of evidence that, in any other sphere of life, would be regarded as incontestable. I think Mark would believe that if he was alive today. And that is still the challenge of his book. So, and secondly, we come to the response that Jesus' disciples are to give to those who do not welcome them. To shake dust off one's feet was in Jesus' day to despairingly walk away from those who showed no willingness to listen. But it was more than that. Jesus speaks of this action as being a testimony against them. We might also almost say that it was a declaration of their folly and, above all, their guilt in viewing good news as bad, in refusing to accept Jesus for who he was and is. It was simply to turn their backs on God. All of which helps us to see the point of this story. Jesus wanted everyone to be brought face to face with who he was and the evidence that supported his claims. Or at least to begin to ask the question, who is this? No one ever spoke or acted like him. There were those, as we have seen, ready to pick up the challenge, but there were those whose minds were dead and whose hearts were like stone, and would very simply never welcome him, deaf to what they heard and blind to what they saw. And that is the challenge of this story for us. It asks us which group best describes us. Are we ready to venture on Jesus, recognizing there is more than enough to begin to take perhaps tentative steps to following him, anxious to understand him better and to discover whether he is indeed the answer to our own deep inner emptiness and restlessness? Or are we locked in the grasp of death? A self-imposed death that cannot hear in the words of Jesus or see in what he did the definitive answer to the human condition, to our condition, to yours and to mine.